Good evening, Professor.
Okay, you guys hear me? Then that's good. Any question for today? Okay, so you're gonna have a quiz next time, which will cover the chapters that we have discussed so far. So it's a short quiz. It's a half an hour quiz. It's on your module if you look at it, but we'll have it next time. So I want you guys to study and hopefully you do well on it. Any question?
Is the quiz multiple choice or is like writing our answers?
I have not made it yet, so I don't really know. But I have done both ways, so I will see how I will do it. Yeah. Either way, you have to study for it. So, and any question? Okay, make sure you do your reading, your question that you gave me, and then because it could be from your own questions. I don't know what you guys are doing, but in the past, most of my classes, somebody or 2 or 3 people volunteer. They open up a web page so that everyone can post their questions on that web page, so everyone is aware of what are the questions that everyone asks, and they answer to it, and they study that. I don't know if you guys have done such a thing or not, but that's something that you can share, and that will be beneficial to you guys for midterm quizzes and final exam. All right. If there's no question, I'm going to start lecturing on chapter 7, which is your transportation planning. And that's what we're going to do. Now, any question before I start? Okay, the first question, the transportation planning is, as if you remember, we said that in transportation, on the first lecture, we do planning, and then we will do the design, and then we do construction, and then we do operation, and then we do management and maintenance. So these are the cycle that I went through. It was on the slide that I show you. It is on your video that I put in, if you can look at it. So the first part was planning. The planning, I will emphasize more on planning on this class. The main reason is that, first of all, planning is very important in our transportation analysis or in engineering. The reason is that without planning, pretty much it's hard to design something or build them. And secondly, is the planning takes a long time to do, and a lot of times it takes several years to do a plan a transportation facilities. Another reason that I'm emphasizing on planning in our transportation 3700 is mainly because we have other classes that you can take if you're interested in the area of transportation, such as highway design, pavement design. Those are like 4710 and and 4720. You can take those design classes if you are interested in the design. So they are pre-comprehensive design class. And then on the operation, we have a class 4740, which is called traffic engineering. So you can take that one also on operation. But as an undergraduate, there is no planning class except what I'm discussing in this class. So, in order for a person that might be interested in transportation to be exposed to planning and design and operation of the transportation system, I will emphasize planning here to complete that those topics for undergraduate students. So we are emphasizing a little bit more on the planning side in this class than any other part. Although we're going to talk a little bit about other part, but not as extensive as the planning part. All right. So the planning basically, in the old days, what was happening was that people were arbitrarily designing things. So a bunch of engineers were getting together. For instance, if they wanted to design a highway, bunch of engineers get together and then look at the map and then decide that, okay, from point A to point B, we want to design a highway. And they just guess that, okay, should we put a 2-lane or 3 lanes? So they were doing arbitrary 3 lane or 4 lanes. So they were then looking at that and selecting their route based on their judgment and do that. So that was before 1950s. Most of the planning was done that way. But after 1950, people start looking at elements of the planning. They saw that the planning is very important because you plan, for instance, a highway for today, but by the time we build them, it would take several years to build. So it takes 10 years, 15 years to build them. And then we need to know by that time what is needed. So therefore they decided that no, we got to come up with some strategy and some way of doing planning. And then you will see that if you want to do planning, it requires computer. And you could just see that by the network analysis that I did last time. So what we did on that network analysis, I did, one, we needed a table, okay, and on that table, the nodes that we did 1, 2, 3, and all the way 1 to 24 nodes that we had. That was a small problem, and then 1 through 24 nodes. And what we did last time, we did from node number 1. Okay, can you mute that microphone, please? Can you mute that microphone, please?
Sorry.
Okay, so if you wanted to do that, from node number 1, what we did, we found the minimum travel time path from node 1 to 1, which was 0. And then we found all this travel time for each node, if you remember. So that was only one row of this metrics. So we did from node 1 to all other nodes. And I asked you to do another row, which as a homework you are supposed to do, okay? But if you want to get that done, which we need them later on, we need to do that problem 24 times in order to establish this table that we need them for our planning later on. You will see where we use them. So doing 24 times that problem, and that was a very small problem because it was only 24 nodes, it requires a lot of time. So the only way we can do it is by computer, the computer programs that we have. So most of the time, anything less than 500 nodes, it's considered as a small problem. For instance, I was buying a software program for our network analysis. And when I asked him how much it is, the guy said $5,000. I said, well, $5,000, I don't have that money. School doesn't have money to buy $5,000 for this network analysis. So how can I get it cheaper? And he said, well, where do you use them? And I said, well, I'm using it only for teaching, education. He said, well, you don't need that many nodes. So I have a software that only 500 nodes can be analyzed. So if you, for educational purposes. So if you buy it for less than 500 or about 500, I can sell it to you for $500. So he considered 500 nodes as a small problem for educational purposes. So most of the problem that we have 1,000 and 2,000 and 5,000 nodes that we have to do. And we cannot do the problem with 5,000 nodes 5,000 times in order to get that metrics. So just look at it and see that without computer, we cannot really do much in planning. We need computer. Sometimes in the old days, I remember that I had some problem that I needed to do, and our computer was not strong enough. So I was giving a problem to my computer at that time, and 3 days later, I was going, and the computer still was working to get me the answers. So now we have much higher speed, and we can do it with much faster way to do those type of problems. So without computer, we cannot really do it. So after 1950, when the computer came about, so the planning started expanding, and then it got more advanced and more advanced. So now that we have it today, very advanced type of planning that we have to do. All right. And then most of the universities, they were not paying attention that much to the planning part. They, for instance, they had only design, mostly pavement design, highway design, and things like that, or traffic engineering, but nothing in planning. So in after 1960s and 70s, most of the universities start hiring faculty member in the area of planning because they thought it is important. And as a matter of fact, that's why I got the job at Cal State LA, because my specialty was planning. When I came here, they had somebody in the design, they had pavement design and the design, but they didn't have anybody in the planning area. So that's why I got this job at that time. So a lot of universities hire faculty member in the area of planning because that start going much more extensively and more important. So now, a couple of questions that we have to answer. One is that why are we doing planning? What are the reasons for doing planning? Okay, so I could just summarize that the reason that we are doing planning are a lot, but I give you a few of them. So why do we need planning? The first reason we can say that any project that we do in transportation takes a long time. So it takes a long time to build a transportation system, whether it's a highway, airport, rail system, whatever it is. It takes a long time. So because it takes a long time, for instance, on the freeway, on the average, is between 10 to 15 years. So if you decide to build a highway from point A to point B, okay, if you want to build that highway, from the first day, it might take you up to 15 years to complete that. So now if I'm sitting over there, I said, okay, today there is 100,000 cars that's going to go between A to B. How many lanes do I need? So I find that, well, for 100,000 vehicles, maybe I need 6 lanes. Now, by the time I build them and finish it, 15 years later, I might need 12 lanes, not 6 lanes. because 6 lane is for today, and I don't have a highway today, but it might be 12 lanes. Why? Because the number of vehicles growing, population is growing, so we need more lanes for the future. So I cannot best guess at this time. I have to find or forecast what is needed at 15 years later. So we usually do a long-term planning, which basically we do it for 25 to sometime 40 years. What is needed 25 years from now? Not today. So because of that, we need the transportation planning. So we need to forecast to see how many cars are going to go between A to B 25 years later, and then plan the whole thing for building a highway that accommodate 25 years demand. So that's one of the reasons that we need planning. The second thing that we need is compatibility. What does that mean? Means every section of a transportation system has to be compatible. That means it has to work together. For instance, on the airport, if I have a capacity of a runway system that every 30 seconds an airplane land and depart, I have to make sure that the number of gates that are open to ticket people are enough gates that people can flow to go to the gates and then get on the plane and depart. I have to make sure that the security that screen people have a capacity of letting people to go in order to be able to go to the gate that for a plane that goes every 30 seconds. I have to make sure that the elevator and escalators has enough capacity for people to move from one point to another point on the airport. I have to make sure that there are enough parking spaces available for people to park and go. And I have to make sure that the highways or rail that take you to the airport have enough capacity for people to be able to get to the airport. If one of them does not work, it doesn't matter that 30-second airplane can land and depart. We cannot get the flow of people to the airplane. So that means every component of the transportation system has to be compatible with each other. For instance, if I have a 2-lane highway here and then and suddenly a 4-lane highway merge into the 2-lane, I might have problem because the 4-lane volume of the traffic on the 4-lane coming to the 2-lane will have a bottleneck, and then cars start backing up. So they are not compatible. So they have to work together. So that's the reason we need planning. We cannot arbitrarily do things. Okay, so that's the second reason, which is very important. The third reason is secure funding. Okay, so when we are trying to build something, we need money. How are you going to get the money? Well, you got to know what is the size of the plan. How many lane freeway you're going to design for, build them. And then you have to figure out that where to get the money. Federal government give you money, state give you money, local area give you money, and sometimes you have to sell some type of a municipal bonds in order to get money to build the highways. Or sometimes you have to raise taxes, as we have been doing in LA, in order to be able to get funding to build the infrastructure. So in order to secure funding, we need to have a plan. And that plan, we have to estimate what would be the cost of that plan, how much it's going to cost us, so that we know how much money we need to know. So that's very important. The fourth thing, which is important, is environmental problems. So we have, we have to know what's the environmental impact of our system, of transportation system that we are designing. How much air pollution we are creating, how much noise pollution we are creating. What are we going to do about it? So we have to solve those problems before we can be able to build them. Because as I mentioned last time, you cannot build anything that causes environmental impact. People will be against this. Environmentalists will be against it. So if you create too much of a noise pollution, you got to figure out what to do. Maybe you have to put a wall there, or you have to come up with a solution. So all those environmental problems needed to be addressed. So in order to do that, you need a plan. You need to know, because the 2-lane highway noise is different than a 12-lane highway noise. So you got to have that plan in order to be able to address those problems: air pollution, noise pollution, water pollution, whatever, even disturbing wildlife. If you go through, wooded area, or some area with the inhabitants. So you have to address all those problems before you be able to build. And then last one that I think is important is public participation. Public participation. You need a plan to present to public for their approval. You probably have experienced that. Every time some transportation project is being built in your neighborhood, they send you a flyer that you can participate. And if you have any voice against it, you can present that. So public should be aware of what is happening in their neighborhood. So usually there are, um, meeting that they put for public, and they tell them what is happening, what would be the impact in that neighborhood, and what would be good about it, what would be bad about it. They have to get their approval in order to build. Okay, so if there is no public approval, the project is not going to be made. But in order to do that, you got to have a plan. You got to tell them, are you building a 2-lane highway, or are you building 8-lane highway? Why are you building 8-lane highway? So you have to show them that you have forecasted how many cars is going to go 25 years from now. So you are buying the land and make it available for the expansion and so on, and how many lane you're going to build now, how many lane you're going to add in the future, and so on. So your whole plan has to be presented. So that's why you need the planning. So these are like 5 major that I wanted to discuss, that why we need the planning. Okay. Now, any question? Okay. Now, there are different types of planning. One is called short term, one is called long term. Okay. short-term planning, long-term planning. The short-term planning, anything that happened less than 5 years, almost, we call short-term planning. And there are a lot of examples of short-term planning. For instance, if you're going on a on-ramp to a freeway and suddenly your car breaks down, or you run out of the gas, or you get a tire problem, you stop, so the cars cannot go on that on-ramp. So usually the police comes, close that ramp, and reroute the traffic through another ramp. And that's a short-term planning. So maybe until you fix your car or get a gas or get out of that on-ramp, there will be a plan that how people have to move. It could take them 1 hour or 5 hours or 10 hours or even 20 minutes. So that's the short-term planning. Another example of it is that, for instance, we're going to have a football game in the Rose Bowl. Usually some weekend during fall, we'll have some type of activities in Rose Bowl. For instance, USC plays with UCLA. That's a big game at the Rose Bowl usually. Okay? Now, what do? The police or planner do? They come during that day, that Saturday, and they plan how the vehicle has to move, where they should park, and how they are to move that does not create congestion. So they make some streets one way, blocking people to move from one side to the other side. And they do all kind of things to reduce congestion for that day. When the game is over, that's it. Everything open up and goes back to the normal situation. So that's the short-term planning that will happen on that Saturday at the Rose Bowl area. Or longer one, some cities have Olympic activities. So what the planners do, they plan the whole city what will happen, because they know they will have so many visitors during that 1 month. So they plan everything that the congestion will be the least amount. So that's the short-term planning, because it takes about a month to do it. Or sometimes there are certain bridges is being built, so that you have to reroute the traffic through other areas while this bridge is being built, and it might take for 3, 4, 5 years to be built. So again, that's another short-term planning. Okay, so these are examples of short-term planning. But what are the long-term planning? Long-term planning usually is between 25 to 40 years. So if I want to build a highway, that will be a long-term planning. So I have to do that long-term. So I want to do, what I'm supposed to do in the long term, 25 years to 40 years. So on the long term, there are 3 basic elements of long-term planning. The first one is forecasting demand. For the system. So we have to figure out, if I'm building a highway from A to B, I have to see how many cars are going 25 years from now on that section of the highway if I build that. So I have to forecast that, estimate it, and we'll talk about how to forecast later on. And the second thing that we do in long-term planning is description of economic, social, and environmental changes. That basically develop, accompany the development of the system. So we have to figure out if we are building that highway, what will be happening to economic and social and environmental changes in that area. For instance, I remember that in the San Francisco area in 1970s, they built a BART system, rapid transit system, from East Bay to San Francisco. So because they built this rapid transit, which is called BART, from East Bay to San Francisco, a lot of cities start being developed along the BART system on the east part of the bay, such as cities such as Concord, Walnut Creek, and so on. And what was the reason? Because San Francisco was very congested, had a very high rent. The prices of housing was very, very high. So people decided to buy home further away in those cities that were not really developed at that time and move and go to work with the BART system. So the BART system causes the development of these cities. As these cities develop, there is a social and economic and environmental changes happening in that area because of this transportation system. Or the same thing when you're building a highway from one point to another point, you're providing access. Because of that access, then some cities are being developed along the highways. Start with a few gas stations and then fast food restaurants and so on, and, and start growing. So it has some social and economic changes in that area. So the third element is the evaluation of the system. So will be an evaluation of the system in terms of benefit and disbenefit occurring. from the options. So the third one is we are evaluating the system that we are building, highways, railways, whatever it is, the benefit that give us and this benefit that give us, to evaluate it, to see if we are better, if our benefit is greater than our this benefit, and so on. So we have to get all the positive and negative and so on. So one of the things that we do in the long-term planning is writing what we call environmental impact report. The environmental impact report. And this is called EIR. You will, if you do any project, you will see that there are a lot of EIR. For every project, we have to do EIR, environmental impact report. What does that do? Well, it gives us all the environmental impact, social impact, and economic impact of that transportation system in that neighborhood. It gives us all the benefit and disbenefit of the system. So for instance, sometimes a project can benefit. Environmental impact report always is not negative. So when you're building a highway, building a rail system, you can create some more employment along those areas, expansion of the urban areas. So those are positive. And obviously some negative will be environmental impact, like air pollution, noise pollution, and so on, and congestion and so on. But there are benefit and disbenefit. And we have to state all of those in environmental impact report. Usually these reports are huge. For every project that we do, we have to do this environmental impact report, and there are huge documentation that we have to establish what will be the air pollution impact, noise pollution impact, traffic congestion. So one section of it is the traffic impact report, which I will discuss that later on. So these are all in that document. So on the long-term planning, these are the three basic things that we have to do. Forecasting demand, what will be the demand in the future? What will be the description of economic, social, environmental changes? And how do we evaluate the system in terms of benefit and disbenefit? Okay, you can read more about it if you want on page 191 of your textbook and 192. Okay. All right. Any question? All right. Next thing I want to talk about is the hierarchical structure of the land use and transportation planning. Okay. Okay. The hierarchical structure of land use and transportation planning. Okay. First of all, we'll talk about land use a lot. And what does the land use means? Land use means that how the land is being used. Now, in most of the urban area, if you go to a urban and regional planning section of the city and ask them that I like to have a land use map of my city. Land use map of my city. What they do, they give you a land use map. So if this is your city, they give you this. And this is, as you see here, is divided into different sections, okay? And each of those sections tell you how the land is being used. For instance, this area will be pretty much like high density residential area. Which means what? Means all the high-rise building will be in that area. This area will be low density residential area, which means what? All the single family homes are there. This is going to be medium density residential area. All the duplexes, 2 or 3 story building will be in that area. Not high rises, not the single family. This area could be all the office spaces, commercial area, shopping centers. And maybe this area will be industrial park. That means all the industry in that area will be concentrated in that area. So this is a land use map. So when we talk about land use, means that how the land is being used. It could be used by different ways. High density residential, low density residential, commercial, medium density, or industrial park. So the word land use, when you're referring it to it, that's what it means, how the land is being used. All right, now, in that hierarchical structure, the first one is national planning. National planning. Okay? So, what is the national planning? Means that people who are at the capital, like for instance in Washington, D.C., and they decide about what the transportation should be in the United States. They are trying to plan that. So what type of things that they're looking at? They are looking at the economic development, policies. They are looking at the transportation policies. They are looking at the funding. They are looking at the regulation. And requirement for local area planning. Okay, these are the problems that they are looking at. These are usually pretty much experienced people. They are not looking at just a specific area. They are looking at the whole country. Under the Secretary of Transportation, what type of policy should we adopt for economic to be developed? What should be our transportation policies? For instance, should we encourage more transit or highways? Okay, so for instance, now that we have a new Democrat in our transportation division, now they are talking about expanding high-speed rail in most of the cities. They want to do that. So that's the policies. They're not looking at one area, they're looking at the whole country. So they want to encourage more people to use mass transit, rail system. They're going to look at the funding. So you know that transportation budget is, after defense budget, is one of the highest budget. So where should the funding go? So they look at it, maybe we should put so many percentages on building bridges and the highways, so many percentages for research, so many percentages for repairing the bridges and so on, so many percentages for planning. So they go to decide that what percentage of the pot of the money that they have has to go to different division. So those guys are the one that doing it, and the national planning. On the regulation, they look at it, should we regulate the transportation industry or deregulate them? Okay, there are advantages of regulation and there's advantage of deregulation. For instance, back in 1980, the air transportation was deregulated. What does that mean? It means before 1980, if an airline wanted to increase the prices of the ticket or reducing it, they had to get a permission to do that. Or if they wanted to fly another route, they had to get a permission. That was very difficult to do. It was regulated by government. Then the government decided to deregulate them. Say that, it's a free market, do whatever you want. So that's why the price war came between the airlines, and each of them have a different price and fare, different time of the day, different days of the week, different months. So government doesn't have anything to do with it. So the advantage was that because of the competition, the price of the airline ticket came down a lot more. I remember that back in 1972, I flew from Wisconsin, actually from Chicago. I flew from Chicago to California, and I remember that I paid $400 for my round trip ticket at that time. But now, after, 50 years, I can probably do that in $200, $250 sometimes if I just do it. So that was the advantage of deregulation. But there was a disadvantage of deregulation because the smaller cities lost services, because small cities are not profitable for airline. So a lot of them decided they don't want to go. Even if they want to go, they go once a week or twice a week. The frequency came down. So those guys lost some services. And because it's not beneficial, their prices are pretty high. So for instance, if you want to go from here to San Jose or San Francisco, you can pay very, very cheap prices, maybe $40, $50 sometimes. But if you want to go from here to Carmel, which is a small city in that Northern California, or some other smaller cities, you probably have to pay $500, $600 for it. Okay, that was the disadvantage of deregulation. And another thing was that it put some of the airlines into bankruptcy. They could not compete, so they went bankrupt. Or some of them were small, so they were bought by these big companies. So there were advantage and disadvantage. Who decide about the regulations or regulation? At the national planning. So they look at it, the benefit and this benefit of it, and then they decide which way to go. The trucking industry has been the same situation, has been deregulated. Now, again, they decide that what local area has to do for planning? What's required from them to do in the planning section? So these are some of the things that probably it's being done at the national planning. Any question on that? So most of these people who work at the national planning, they are pretty much appointed. They are very experienced people that are appointed to look at the whole picture of the whole country, not the only specific area. One level lower is called comprehensive regional planning. Under the comprehensive regional planning, so we go one level lower. Instead of looking at the whole country, we look at the section of the US, for instance, East Coast, West Coast, South Coast, and so on. For instance, California is a huge state, so maybe we just look at California as a comprehensive regional planning. So who are those planners? Planners that are sitting in Sacramento and look at the whole California and see what is required. So what do? They create a comprehensive regional plan. They look at the population, for instance. What's the population of the state? And then what would be the projection of it? So they look at population and economic projection. So they want to know what will be happening 25 years from now as far as population growth is concerned, as far as economic growth is concerned. They look at the land use map or the land use plans. What is going to be the plan in the whole California? Obviously, some area will be agriculture, some will be urban areas, and so on. And they overall they look at what is the transportation requirement. So what should they do? So they plan that. Should we build for instance, high-speed rail or not? Okay, should we build more highways or not? So what should we do for the whole state? So they are not looking at the country anymore. They just look at the state of California in this case. So they develop this comprehensive regional plan. Okay? Any question? All right. The third one, we call it one step lower, we call regional. Regional transportation planning. So instead of looking at the whole California, maybe we just look at the Southern California or Northern California or mid California, because for instance, Southern California, what we need as a transportation requirement is different than Central California. Central California is mostly agriculture area. So the requirements for the roads are different than Southern California, which is more urban area. So regional transportation planning, instead of looking at the whole California, maybe we look at the Southern California transportation planning. So for instance, in Southern California, one of the agency that's in charge of the transportation planning at Southern California is called SCAG. SCAG. SCAG stands for Southern California Association of Government. We call SCAG. They are in charge of regional transportation planning of Southern California. So each of these areas Central California, Northern California have similar agencies that do the transportation planning. As a matter of fact, SCAG is a multi-story building downtown LA on Wilshire and 8th. And there are a lot of people, at least 200-300 people I know working there, a lot of PhDs working there. So they plan the whole transportation system for Southern California. A lot of projects over there. As a matter of fact, a couple of my old students were hired in old days by SCAG that they were working there. So what type of things they do? So they look at the regional system. So what is needed in Southern California? Again, they're looking at the policies on local portion of system. So pretty much they look at what Southern California is needed, what type of system should we build, and what are we supposed to do with regard to the policies and so on. One step lower, we get to a small area. Or project transportation planning. Now, when you're looking at small area project transportation planning, instead of looking at Southern California, we're gonna look at like city of Los Angeles. Small area, although city of Los Angeles is not a small area, but looking at the smaller than Southern California, all Southern California. So for that, we're gonna work, what are they doing city of Los Angeles for planning? So each of these divisions that you have, you can get a job in those planning in those sections. For instance, the city of Los Angeles Department of Transportation Planning, they have a lot of people working there, and they're just planning for the city of LA. So they look at specific plans for project. So they are looking at what we should build as the new facilities, such as highways, rail system, bus terminals, whatever. So they look at the, for instance, even the freight carriers. What should we do as far as the freight carriers? For instance, in the city of LA, okay, we want to provide some type of a good movement of freight carriers by building a rail system, be it or highways. And then another thing that's important is always planning for financing. So any of those projects that we want to build, where are we going to get the money? How are we going to get it? So we are going to plan for the financing. So those are what the planners do. Any project, building a diamond lane, for instance, building a bicycle path, all of those is under the small area of project transportation planning for the city, or transit, buses, and so on. Then one step lower, you get to facility or service design. So facility or service design. Then you get again smaller. So what is that? You get into construction plan. Okay, such as, for instance, let's say you want to build a um, signal on an intersection. So the first thing you need to do, you need to plan it. You need to plan where you're going to put the signal. How do you operate it? How do you build it? How much is going to cost? So the whole construction plan has to be built up. So anything that you want to do, you've got to have a construction plan. So those are the facility and service design. And then the last thing that you want to do is system operation. Or management planning. Okay, so we have to do system operation, and that requires planning. For instance, road traffic control. Okay, so how do we control traffic and regulation? How do we regulate the traffic? Transit route. And schedule. And fares. So these are some of the things you have to do. There's a lot to do in system operation. For instance, we have a highway operation. The highway operation include all the message sign that you put, that you see every day. That's part of the operation. The freeway operation is that we are watching freeway, as I mentioned it before, with the cameras that we have all the time. Make sure that the traffic is going smoothly. If some incident happen on the freeway, for instance, a car breakdown, or you ran out of gas, or you have a flat tire, in the operations center, they can see you on the freeway that you're blocking the traffic. So they send somebody right away to give you gas and change your tire and get you out of there for free. So if you have during a peak hour, if you have this type of a problem, just stay in your car. Don't do anything because they are seeing you. And they send somebody over there to save you. So that's part of the system operation. Incident management is part of the system operation. So system operation of the freeway is huge. We have centers, they are sitting constantly watching to see if something goes wrong, to correct them. They do the same thing with the intersections in the downstairs of or basement of the city hall. If you go over there, they are looking at over 1,500 signals that's in the city of Los Angeles. They're looking at all the signals to see if there's a traffic jam. They can change the signal timing and program it somehow to get rid of the traffic jam. In the rail system, all the rail and metros that we have, again, we have the same center. They're watching all the station. They're looking at all the rail system. That's the system operation. And again, on the buses, I mentioned that if you go to the 5th floor of the MTA building behind Union Station, they're watching all the buses in the city of LA. They're operating that. So all of those are system operation. And the airport, obviously, they're watching everyone, and they're watching all the airplanes. That operation of this airport is a huge also. So all modes of transportation has a system operation and management planning. So basically, if you're a planner, you can be in any of these divisions as I mentioned. Obviously, you can start from the lower one. As you get more experience, you advance to the higher one. So the one in the national planning requires a lot of years of experience and judgment. So there's a lot of jobs in the planning which happens in any of these. So you can go to City of LA, Department of Planning. You can, pretty much every city has the Department of Planning, because they have to plan. Whatever you do, you have to plan it first before you do anything. You have to plan it, find the money, schedule it, design it, and do the construction and so on. All right, so that gives you the hierarchical structure of planning. Any question on that? All right, if there's no question, we end the session here. Make sure you go through this notes and study it and read the chapter 7. And obviously you gotta provide the question from there. Okay, any question before I leave? Okay, so make sure you study for your quiz next time. Okay, have a nice evening.